Here's a question that almost nobody ever asks. Why is the Coast Guard the only branch of the military that does not sit inside of the Department of Defense? Disclaimer, I understand it is now called the Department of War, but I've been in the military for way too long and I'm going to resort back to what I know. And it will be called the Department of Defense in this video. That one structural decision shapes how the Coast Guard enforces law, protects borders, prevents conflict, and quietly supports national security each and every day. Today, I want to explain how the Coast Guard ended up outside of the Department of Defense, why that decision was intentional, what would actually break if that changed, and why this structure gives the United States a strategic advantage most people never realize exists. By the end of this video, you are going to understand why the Coast Guard is built differently and why it has to stay that way. So let's start by clearing up the biggest misconception. The Coast Guard is not a civilian agency pretending to be military. It is one of the 6 armed forces of the United States. Coast Guard members swear the same oath, they deploy globally, they operate ships and aircrafts, and they do fight wars when called upon. The difference is not whether the Coast Guard is military, the difference is who the Coast Guard works for during peacetime. While the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps, and the Space Force fall under the Department of Defense, the Coast Guard operates under the Department of Homeland Security. The separation is not about prestige or hierarchy, it's about law. To understand why the Coast Guard is not in the Department of Defense, you have to go back to the founding of the country. In 1790, the United States didn't need another army or a navy. It needed money. The federal government depended on tariffs to survive, and smugglers were undermining the economy by avoiding customs duties. Alexander Hamilton pushed for the creation of the Revenue Cutter Service under the Department of Treasury. These cutters were not warships. They were enforcement vessels. Their mission was to board ships, inspect cargo, seize contraband, and arrest violators. That means the Coast Guard's oldest mission is federal law enforcement. And that's why the service lived under the Department of Treasury for over 170 years. When the Department of Defense was created much later, the Coast Guard did not move because its core mission didn't fit inside of a warfighting department. Okay, so this is where the Department of Defense distinction becomes pretty critical. In the United States, there is a deliberate legal wall between military power and civilian law enforcement. That wall exists to protect civil liberties. The Posse Comitatus Act restricts Department of Defense forces from conducting domestic law enforcement, except under very specific circumstances. The Coast Guard is exempt because it is not a DOD force during peacetime. That exemption allows the Coast Guard to enforce laws each and every day without violating constitutional boundaries. If the Coast Guard were placed permanently under the DOD, its ability to conduct routine law enforcement would be legally challenged almost immediately. Maritime law enforcement would slow down, fragment, or it would require constant interagency workarounds. That is not theoretical, it would happen. Because the Coast Guard operates outside of the Department of Defense, it can seamlessly combine military capability with law enforcement authority. So the Coast Guard can board and search vessels without warrants under maritime law, enforce customs, immigration, and fisheries laws, interdict drugs and weapons in international waters, inspect foreign ships before they even enter U.S. ports, and secure critical infrastructure and waterways. Other military branches can assist, but they cannot legally lead these missions. The Coast Guard does not need to hand off authority, it already has it. That legal clarity is operational gold. World War II is the clearest proof that the Coast Guard structure is intentional and flexible. During the war, the Coast Guard transferred over to the Department of the Navy. Coast Guard cutters escorted convoys across the Atlantic, they hunted submarines, and they protected shipping lanes. Coast Guard crews operated landing craft during amphibious assaults, including Normandy. The first American forces that were delivered to shore on D-Day were delivered by Coast Guard personnel. When the war ended, the Coast Guard immediately turned back to its non-DOD status. And that return was not an afterthought. Ports needed inspections, smuggling surged, maritime commerce exploded. The nation needed law enforcement at sea, not permanent warfighting forces. During the Cold War, the Coast Guard became uniquely valuable in contested maritime spaces. Sending a Navy warship into disputed waters sends a military message. Sending a Coast Guard cutter that enforces maritime law sends a lawful one. That difference mattered. Coast Guard vessels enforced fishery regulations, safety laws, and sovereignty claims without escalating conflict. This ability to operate in gray zones between peace and wartime became one of the Coast Guard's most important strategic contributions. The same concept applies today in the Arctic, the South China Sea, and the Indo-Pacific. People often ask why the Coast Guard can't move into the DOD full-time. Here is the honest answer. If the Coast Guard lived permanently under the DOD, it would lose the very authorities that make it so effective. Law enforcement would be restricted, port inspections would be challenged, maritime governance would slow. The Coast Guard's strength comes from its dual identity. Military when necessary, law enforcement always. That balance disappears under DOD control. But there is a downside to this structure. The Coast Guard is expected to operate globally with a fraction of the funding that is given to other military branches. Its missions keep expanding, but the resources don't grow at the same rate. Being outside of the DOD means less visibility, fewer advocates, and constant pressure to do more with less. Understanding why the Coast Guard is structured this way also explains why it is chronically stretched so thin. So this is not an internal government issue. The Coast Guard structure directly affects border security, drug interdiction, port safety, fisheries protection, and national defense. When people misunderstand why the Coast Guard sits outside of DOD, they underestimate the importance. And when they underestimate it, the nation will feel it eventually. The Coast Guard is not outside of the Department of Defense by accident. It's outside by design. That design allows the United States to enforce laws, protect sovereignty, prevent escalation, and defend the nation in ways no other military branch legally can. And now, you know why it matters.